Hello there! Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. Before we get back to business, I'd like to apologise for my prolonged absence from the channel. You know that horrible cliched old phrase, life comes at you fast? Well, I've been juggling a bit of that for the last 6 months or so. With that said, I'm back, I'm refreshed, and I'm ready to get stuck in. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at all of the Max Payne's games running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Fatal Frame game on the Steam Deck. That's Project Zero for us Europeans. If you're new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each port a compatibility score out of 10 before issuing a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Each port also needs to render at the deck's native resolution. Lastly, I'll be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus. It's worth mentioning that these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on the deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through Steam OS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. Spurred on by the success of Konami's Silent Hill and the incoming powerhouse that was the PS2, Tecmo stalwarts Makoto Shibata and Keisuke Kikuchi set out through the year 2000 to create a survival horror event of their own. Drawing on Shibata's own spiritual experiences and from contemporary Japanese horror, the resulting game was titled Fatal Frame, unless you're in Europe, where it was called Project Zero. That is, of course, unless you're in Japan, where it's just called Zero. Still with me, yeah? Set in the year 1986, Fatal Frame casts you as Miku Hinasaki, seemingly the world's bravest teenager, as she explores Himuro Mansion in search of her missing brother. The mansion in question is dark, damp, and absolutely packed full of ghosts. In typical early 2000s survival horror style, the game is mostly viewed through a fixed camera perspective as you traverse the mansion's suitably grimy and dilapidated surrounds. Fatal Frame's OSP, its big hook, is Miku's very special camera, which is functionally your only form of defense throughout the entire game. Silent Hill has planks of wood with nails in, Resi has a military-grade armory, Fatal Frame has some film and a lens. I'm not being sarcastic here either. This is without a doubt the best part of this game. As Miku, you engage with both ghosts and puzzles using nothing but a camera. In addition, you can only actually see the enemies you're up against by looking through the camera's appropriately cramped viewfinder. To get rid of any spectral pursuers, you'll want to wait until they're right up in your face before snapping a picture of them. This is great. This is the developer saying, look, if you really want to do some damage in our game, you're going to have to scare yourself as much as possible. Outside of this central mechanic, things are a little more threadbare than Fatal Frame's contemporaries. The game's soundscape is a terrifying plus point. However, this first outing is very short, the environments are very repetitive, and the voice acting is terrible. Not in a Silent Hill-esque ethereal dreamy way, just in a wow that's frankly awful kind of way. Despite its shortcomings, Fatal Frame is absolutely still worth a play because it succeeds in being really scary. I know that's not the most razor-sharp critique of a survival horror game, but I think it speaks to the strength of its most unique elements that over 2 decades on, it can still make me brick it. So, scary game is scary, confirmed, but how does it run on the deck? For our testing, we're kicking things off with the PS2 version of the game being played via PC SX2. Released in 2001, this original port of the game holds up rather well on Valve's handheld. Performance is mostly locked at a stable 60 frames per second, with no required tweaks to clock speeds or to the emulator itself. I did notice some intermittent audio stutter that seemed to present itself mostly during the game's many cutscenes. Part of me feels, however, that this is a result of the game being read off of an SD card. If you were to plonk the game on your internal SSD instead, you'd likely be able to dodge any IO-related slowdown. Graphically, the game holds up well. PCSX2's built-in deinterlacing step does a decent job of cleaning up the image whilst still retaining the game's distinct atmosphere. The only real drawback I can feel is the emulator's inherent input latency, which is something I've spoken about before at length regarding PCSX2. If you're playing on a fancy new OLED deck, you're less likely to feel this thanks to that system's lower overall latency. On a standard deck, however, the game feels unnecessarily sluggish. I had some issues lining up my viewfinder in order to Pokemon Snap passive ghosts in the environment, all thanks to that lag. It isn't a game-breaking issue by any means, but it does impact the overall experience, and it is worth mentioning. With that said, Fatal Frame via PCSX2 succeeds in more areas than it falters. Good visuals, accurate emulation, and solid performance are notable plus points, with just that intermittent audio stutter and pernicious input lag holding the game back from a perfect score. The game scores a respectable compatibility rating of 8 out of 10 on deck. 8 months after Fatal Frame seanced its way onto the PS2, Tecmo put out a graphically superior port for Microsoft's shiny new Xbox, which you're currently looking at running on the deck via xemu. You'll likely notice that image quality is already a step above what we could achieve within PCSX2. This is mostly thanks to the game not needing to be de-interlaced within xemu prior to its upscale. Original NTSC Xbox games already ran at 480p, a nice, progressive and modern resolution. This port would be an absolutely ideal way to play the game on deck if it weren't for the old xemu special, in that it runs at half speed roughly 3/4 of the time. Despite the game's input latency feeling more responsive than the PS2 port, the game's slow motion presentation renders it completely unplayable. If you were to somehow be able to power through the game's lackluster pace, you'd soon be stopped dead in your tracks by the game's main mechanic being broken within xemu. The reticule that's meant to display around ghosts when they're viewed through your camera simply doesn't show up. Brilliant. Fatal Frame within xemu then is something of a fatal failure. Crispy image quality and superior visuals are utterly hamstrung by broken mechanics and slow-mo gameplay. The Xbox version of Fatal Frame therefore scores a compatibility rating of 4 out of 10 on Steam Deck. And that's that! A survival horror franchise is born, and its 2 ports are put through their paces on deck. It should come as no surprise that PCSX2 is your ideal destination for Fatal Frame on the handheld. To subject yourself to the Xbox port in its current state would be nothing short of insanity. That might be a little extreme. It doesn't run good. Play the PS2 version. Just 2 years after Fatal Frame was let loose on unsuspecting horror fans the world over, Shibata & Co. followed the game up with an indirect sequel. Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly was released in 2003 for the PS2 before receiving an enhanced port for the Xbox in 2004. Years later in 2012, it would also receive a full-on remake for the Nintendo Wii. One of the key criticisms Makoto Shibata claimed to receive regarding the first game in the series was that it was simply too scary for players to finish. Now look, far be it from me to accuse a qualified Japanese game developer of humble bragging, but I'd say in this instance, it's totally justified. To address this concern, they didn't go anywhere near the idea of toning down the scares for the sequel. Instead, the team just did their best to make the story more engaging, so that players were more inclined to see the game through to completion. Taking place generations before the events of the first game, Fatal Frame 2 steps away from Himuro Mansion and its associated parties to focus on sister duo Mio and Mayu as they explore the fictional village of Minakami. And you know what? The story is more interesting this time around. There's a little more intrigue, a little more show and don't tell. It's still very lore and cutscene heavy, especially through its opening hours, but there's a more captivating yarn being spun here for sure. It's also scarier than the first game, a lot scarier. The soundscape in particular just consistently puts me on edge. It nails that sort of droning unease that Silent Hill also does so well, pairing it up with great scares in abundance. The camera obscura is back. In fact, this game is something of an origin story for the spectral snapper. The core gameplay loop of having to wait until extremely frightening apparitions are right up in your grill before adding them to your cringe compilation has carried over intact. It's still fun, it's still very scary, and the refinements Tecmo made to the game's art direction in particular certainly add to the fright factor. Fatal Frame 2 is great. But is it great on deck? We're starting off once again with the PS2 version of the game being played via PC SX2 within SteamOS. For the most part, all of the praise and criticism I applied to the first game's performance within the stalwart PS2 emulator can also be applied here. Fatal Frame 2 looks good. It upscales and is deinterlaced cleanly within PC SX2. The first game's heavy reliance on film grain has been toned down slightly this time around, so this certainly benefits those of us upscaling the game and playing it at a modern HD resolution. Sadly though, input lag and occasional stutter are still common bugbears for the series' second entry. Fatal Frame must just be one of those PS2 games that caches data on the fly from its disc, which leads to some I/O related stutter if you're playing it from an SD card on your deck. Input lag I've spoken about before. It's a common PC SX2 issue, and it seems to centre around the emulator's input plugin as opposed to the emulation itself. The spectral combatography in Fatal Frame 2 is more fast-paced than in the original, which highlights just how sluggish the emulator can feel in regards to its latency. Despite these issues, PC SX2 is still a fine way to play Fatal Frame 2 on the deck. Clean visuals and good performance are held back once again by occasional stutter and wonky input latency. The game scores a compatibility rating of 8 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Just like the first game in the series, Fatal Frame 2 also received an expanded and enhanced port for Microsoft's Xbox console 1 year after its PS2 debut. And here it is, running via the xemu emulator within SteamOS. The main menu imprints a positive first impression at least. Image quality looks crisp, audio sounds good, and controller response is sharp. Attempting to actually play the game, however, well, that's just expecting too much in this case. Booting up the game in its original form sees us freezing at the initial load and getting no further. Rebooting the game and attempting to engage with this port's exclusive FPS mode yields slightly more encouraging results. We see the first cutscene, get into the game's first bit of walking, hit the second cutscene, and bam, we're stopped dead in our tracks again. Brilliant. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that Fatal Frame 2 within xemu, well, it absolutely stinks. A nice looking main menu is about all we get, followed up by immediate freezes in-game. Crimson Butterfly's Xbox port scores a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on deck. In the first of what I assure you will be many weirdly timed Fatal Frame ports, Crimson Butterfly received a full-on remake for the Wii 11 years after its initial release, but only in Europe, Japan and Australia. Project Zero 2 Wii Edition was built off of the Xbox port as a base, touching up the game's art style, remaking the cutscenes entirely, and shifting the perspective to an over-the-shoulder Resi-style camera. If you have access to a Wii, or to a decent way to emulate the game using a Wiimote and nunchuck, I'd argue that this is the quintessential way to play Fatal Frame 2 in the modern day. On Steam Deck, however, well, that's a different story. We're emulating the game within Dolphin here, and whilst performance is good, frame pacing is a little off at times, making the game feel artificially choppy. Visuals look great and upscale really nicely to the deck's display, however, the big issue here is obviously going to be the game's control scheme. The remake's heavy reliance on the Wiimote and nunchuck means that in order to play the game on deck, you'd need to spend considerable time mapping out a new controller preset for the game, both within Dolphin itself and within Steam's own controller mapping tool. Ardent fans of this port may feel as though that's worth the time and effort, but for those of us looking to just pick up the game and play it, that's not really a viable option. Excellent visuals and revamped content aren't enough to mitigate Project Zero 2 Wii Edition's convoluted controls. On the deck at least, those controls are the kiss of death, and as a result, the game scores a compatibility rating of 5 out of 10. So 3 ports this time around and still only one viable option on the Steam Deck. Both xemu and Dolphin fail to provide a playable experience out of the box, leaving us with PC SX2's respectable output as the only viable alternative. It isn't perfect, but thankfully we still have a way to play what is without a doubt one of the survival horror greats on the deck. The final Fatal Frame game to land on 6th generation consoles was 2005's Fatal Frame 3 The Tormented. Releasing your iterative horror sequel the same year as Resident Evil 4 isn't exactly setting it up for success, but for Tecmo, needs must as needs be. In keeping with the 3 in the title, Fatal Frame's third outing follows the story of 3 separate protagonists. Miku returns from the first game to do more of the same, and Rei Kurosawa makes her series debut as a grieving 20-something-year-old photographer who has tragically lost her boyfriend. Rounding out the trio is Kei Amakura, who just so happens to be the uncle of Fatal Frame 2's protagonists. As lore-heavy as the series already was up to this point, Fatal Frame 3's biggest contribution to overall franchise canon is in its attempt to tie everything together under even more lore. This is a noble goal given the fact we're dealing with 3 separate lead characters and a labyrinth of interweaving narratives. In general, this heady mix of elements is handled quite well, but I feel as though the game is criminally let down by some seriously stagnant gameplay and level design. Broadly speaking, Fatal Frame 3 looks good. The issue is that it doesn't really look sufficiently different in comparison to the first 2 games in the series. In gameplay terms, we're mainly using the camera obscura again, and we can level it up with new features like we could in the second game. It just doesn't feel very fresh the third time around. If Fatal Frame 3's narrative and characters grab you within the first hour, you'll likely enjoy your time with the game despite its slightly creaky and archaic gameplay. If, like me, your eyes tend to glaze over as you're introduced to yet another set of vaguely familiar characters and circumstances, you'll end up checking out mentally long before the game reaches any kind of a satisfying conclusion. The only port of the game we have to inspect this time around is for the PS2, as it ultimately ended up as a platform exclusive for the console. As always, we're running the game through PC SX2 within SteamOS, and results are decidedly mixed. Image quality is good, great even, as the game natively supports progressive scan, negating the need for the emulator to do its deinterlacing shtick. With that said, I noticed significantly more visual bugs in Fatal Frame 3 than I did in the prior 2 games. Flickering textures, lighting effects not spanning the entire scene, there's a general feeling of instability to the game's visual presentation within the emulator, which is disappointing. In terms of performance, well, that's not great either. Fatal Frame 3 runs at 30 FPS by default, however, the pacing doesn't feel good. We're definitely seeing the right amount of frames, just not at the right interval. Audio seems fine, there's actually less stutter this time around than I experienced with Fatal Frame 1 and 2, however the input lag is just as present as it's been so far. I won't wax lyrical about this aspect as I've mentioned it twice already, and it is a more subjective element of the emulator's performance than anything, but it is there. On balance then, Fatal Frame 3 stacks up well on PC SX2, just not quite as well as its forebears. Excellent image quality and solid performance is let down by uneven frame pacing, visual bugs and troublesome input latency. As a result, the game scores a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Following on from the less than stellar critical reception to the third game in the series and stiff competition in the survival horror space, Koei Tecmo opted to shift their approach for the franchise's fourth entry in a major way. By forming a development partnership with both Grasshopper and Nintendo, Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse would launch in July of 2008 as a Japan-only Wii exclusive title. You might be looking at this footage thinking, hang on a second, isn't this a bit crispy looking for the Wii? And you'd be right. The game was finally localized, remastered and released on modern platforms 15 years after its initial Wii debut. Between both the game's original version and its remastered counterparts, divisive is probably the most apt terminology that comes to mind. Thematically, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse is strong. We've multiple characters landing on a mysterious island south of Japan on a journey to find out why their friends keep kicking the bucket. Artistically, especially in the remaster, the game is gorgeous, and the ghost design in particular triggers my fight or flight in the best way possible. In gameplay terms, however, the lovely remastered sheen of the game is betrayed slightly by clunky, remapped controls. Not only does Mask of the Lunar Eclipse feel a bit old, it's also immediately evident that this was originally a Wii game, and that there's been some tooling around required in order to map everything over to a traditional control pad. Exploring the environment involves shining a flashlight around using either the Wiimote or the right stick. This reveals glimmering objects that you can then interact with. This would be a fine feature if it worked properly, but detection is hit or miss, and the novelty wears off rather quickly. The camera obscura is obviously a focus once again, and it's our main way of keeping ghouls from getting their spectral mitts on us. Despite the inclusion of a new handy lock-on for you to snap to ghosts, it still feels a bit finicky, as though your pursuers are always moving a little too quickly for the mechanic to keep up. Speaking of movement, God, this game is slow. You move at a snail's pace even when running, and positioning yourself correctly to interact with objects or to zap ghosts with your camera can be a bit of a headache. But you know what? I really like Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, I can't lie. I know I just dunked on practically every aspect of the game's design and technical makeup, but there's something immediately captivating about the game's setting and narrative that's hard for me to pinpoint. It's the closest the series has come to a cold open since its inception, and I think the willingness of the developers to take a step back and let you piece together what's going on instead of constantly feeding you exposition is a really powerful motivator that propels you through the game and past a lot of those flaws. Next to the Crimson Butterfly, this certainly feels like the second strongest entry in the series. Jumping into testing then, and where better to start than with the game's original Wii version. We're running the game via Dolphin within SteamOS, and I think you can probably guess how this is going to pan out. As a quick side note, the specific version of the game I'm playing has been patched and localized solely by the community, an absolutely Herculean effort given the amount of text in the game, so credit where it's due. It would be great to be able to engage with the community's work and enjoy it to the fullest on deck, but thanks to the game's Wii exclusivity and sole compatibility with the Wiimote and Nunchuck, I'm afraid that won't be happening with the deck's built-in controls. Visually, the muted look of the original Wii port still holds up today, and it's reproduced on the deck admirably. Performance is capped at 30 FPS, however we're once again dealing with some slightly less than stellar frame pacing that gives Mask of the Lunar Eclipse a jerky feel. The Achilles heel undermining the entire endeavour here is the game's aforementioned control scheme, which is utterly incompatible with the deck's default controller layout. Much like the Wii exclusive remake of Fatal Frame 2, you could theoretically spend an hour creating a brand new controller preset within Dolphin itself and within the deck's overlay, but come on now, really? In summary, excellent visuals and decent performance are entirely hamstrung by broken controls and less than good frame pacing. The Wii version of Fatal Frame 4 scores a compatibility rating of 5 out of 10 on deck. Hey, speaking of unplayable, get a load of the home console versions of the game's 2023 remaster. Whilst the original Wii version of the game can at least run on the deck via emulation, the PlayStation and Xbox versions of Mask of the Lunar Eclipse are entirely out of reach on Valve's handheld, thanks to there being no compatible emulators capable of running the game with any degree of compatibility. This poor showing nets these particular ports with the episode's first 0 out of 10 compatibility rating. Spooky! Now, with that being said, there is one console version of the game that we can at least boot into, that being the hybrid console version. You know what I'm talking about? Running the game via Ryujinx within SteamOS, and we get a relatively surprising level of performance at the very least. The game actually holds a somewhat stable 30 FPS. The big caveat here is that the game's visuals are utterly broken within the emulator. Geometry has a tendency to flicker in and out of existence, particularly on items incorporating physics or transparency. A decent level of performance and working controls sadly aren't enough to save this version of the game from the proverbial chopping block. This port's completely glitched out visuals and slightly wobbly performance furnish it with a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. The final version of the game we're testing on deck is the PC port running via Proton, and dearie me, this is lovely. Quite literally the only issue I could find with this port of the game was a singular random white flash during the game's opening cutscene. That's it, nothing else of concern to report. Mask of the Lunar Eclipse's 2023 remaster runs like an absolute dream on the deck, hitting a smooth and very stable 60 FPS the vast majority of the time. I'd argue that this game sits in that absolute compatibility sweet spot for the deck, given that it's a rather modest remaster of an older title. It looks gorgeous, but it's not trying to push any crazy path-traced effects that would cripple the deck's limited power budget. It runs well too, benefiting from the same low system requirements. What else can I say? No news is basically good news, right? I've zero compatibility concerns when it comes to playing Mask of the Lunar Eclipse's PC port on the deck. Excellent visuals, phenomenal performance, clean audio and responsive controls earned this port the first 10 out of 10 rating so far. This is without a doubt the best way to play on deck. To be fair, the PC version of the game being the go-to in terms of compatibility is probably something you could have guessed from the outset of this section. Regardless, it's great that this game has been given a wider audience via its modern remaster, and that we have an easy route toward enjoying it on Valve's handheld. Die-hard fans might want to fiddle around with the game's original Wii port, but for the rest of us, the PC version is undoubtedly the best way to go. Following the fourth entry, we wouldn't see a brand new mainline Fatal Frame game until the far-flung future of 2015. All was not lost, however, as this dormancy was to be punctuated by a spin-off for Nintendo's then new 3DS console in 2012. Titled Spirit Camera: The Cursed Memoir, the game used the handheld's 3D cameras and AR capabilities to transform the 3DS into the actual camera obscura. It's an absolutely incredible concept, and it's arguably a perfect fit for the console, but the execution stinks. One of Spirit Camera's biggest missteps is that it's an eerie J-horror experience that you have to play in a well-lit room. I mean, that's just kind of... why does my Big Mac have a banana in it? It just seems at odds with the whole premise. Ghosts appear in your real-world environment, crudely superimposed in a very 2012 fashion, and you have to fling yourself around in order to get them in view and snap them. The game's key narrative device is the Diary of Faces, a mysterious purple tome that sends you, the player, from your own reality into a more traditionally rendered 3D house. It's fine. It feels like a heavily embellished novelty app from the late 2000s, the kind of stuff you would have downloaded onto your iPhone 4 to scare your granny into a cardiac event after Christmas dinner. Reviews were mixed to poor at the time, and it's considered a niche entry into what is already a more niche franchise. Can we play this riveting bit of ambitious software on the deck? Nope. The handheld's lack of a camera sort of invalidates the whole central feature of Spirit Camera, so sadly this one is a bust. It does boot, the key mechanic being unusable on deck however means the game scores a compatibility rating of 1 out of 10. When it finally came time for Koei Tecmo to get the band back together and craft a true follow-up to Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, the team's prior association with Nintendo proved a fertile base to build upon. The only issue there was the console that would ultimately end up being the exclusive stomping ground for this brand new mainline entry. Fatal Frame: Maiden of Blackwater launched as a platform exclusive for Nintendo's floundering Wii U in 2015, before receiving a remaster for modern platforms in 2022. To the game's credit, the Wii U's gamepad serves as the central element to Maiden of Blackwater's gameplay, and the execution is strong. Snapping ghosts with the camera obscura is now done exclusively with the gamepad's built-in screen. I had the opportunity to play the game on an actual Wii U back in the day, and it's fantastic fun. Panning the gamepad in front of your TV reveals ghosts in that space, but you're not limited to the confines of your main screen either. You can freely rotate and track ghosts in a 360-degree field. Spinning chair is optional, of course. The game's narrative is split across the experiences of 3 separate protagonists, Yuri, Ren and Miyu, who just so happens to be the daughter of Miku from the first game. They've all arrived at Hikami Mountain to unravel a greater overarching mystery and put their own personal traumas to bed. Suitably bleak is probably the best way to characterise Maiden of Blackwater's plot. It gives the game a solid backbone, but the expository dialogue and its slightly on-the-nose wooden delivery dulls the impact of moment-to-moment plot revelations. The greater lore and flashbacks are often harrowing, however, in a very good way. The improvements made to the game's main photography mechanic are reason enough to stick with it through some oddball backtracking that really hurts the latter half of Maiden of Blackwater. The game's art direction also deserves a nod. It's a little weird. Some of the characters are very jiggly and they all look like porcelain dolls. Now, I don't have an issue with this at all. I do love Bazoingas, but I did find that the fan service, it often undermines some of the game's scarier moments. Right, enough bazoinga chat. How does the game fare on the deck? The first port we're assessing is the Wii U version. We're running the game via the native Linux version of cemu, and we're not getting great results. Performance is extremely variable, and it's incapable of fully committing to that 30 FPS mark. The audio sucks, as there's a consistent fizzing crackle that accompanies just about every sound the game puts out. Visually, the lighting is absolutely scuffed, so in the interest of viewer comfort, I won't be showing much of it here. Realistically, we wouldn't have gotten very far with this port anyway, on account of its complete reliance on the Wii U gamepad for its central mechanic. I did also try the Windows version of cemu running via Proton, and got nothing but a black screen. Extra spooky. So, broken visuals, check, dodgy performance, that's here too, mechanical incompatibility, 3 for 3, and audio being mangled also. What a treat. The Wii U version of Maiden of Blackwater scores an ectoplasmic 3 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. The only thing worse than a port that runs badly is a port that doesn't run at all. So how about 5 of them? That's right, the PlayStation 4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and Series X ports are untouchable on the deck, as there isn't yet an emulator that can handle those machines in any tangible way. It's fairly self-evident then that these versions of the game score a compatibility rating of 0 out of 10 on deck. Womp womp. Veering back into the realm of the bootable, we have the hybrid console version of the game running via Ryujinx. From the off, performance is relatively stable, however we do get frequent stutters that are accompanied by nasty audio crackle, our old arch nemesis. The biggest barriers to enjoyment, however, are the game's visuals and lighting, which are both broken within the emulator. Both hair and ghosts simply don't render most of the time, making the whole ghost photography thing a bit of a task. The typically spooky and atmospheric lighting is also far too dim and doesn't seem to be kicking out the lumens necessary for us to actually see the scene on screen. This version of the game then is also a bit of a bust. Broken visuals, dim lighting and frequent stutter park this port roughly in line with the original Wii U iteration. That scores the game a 3 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Closing out our collection of ports, and saving this section I might add, is the PC version of the game running via Proton. Much like the excellent Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, Maiden of Blackwater's PC version excels on the deck, especially in comparison to every other version we've tried. As of the making of this video, the game is technically unsupported within SteamOS, but it just kinda works out of the box, and looks damn good in motion too. Performance is a very steady 60 FPS, with only minor stutters making themselves known during fast camera pans. I did see some reports online of certain cutscenes not playing correctly on the deck, and other accounts recalling intermittent audio crackle, but I didn't suffer from any of this during my time with the game. It was essentially perfect. So, great visuals, stellar performance, crisp audio and responsive controls score the PC port with the second and final 10 out of 10 compatibility rating of the episode. With every version of the game now tested, it's fairly obvious which one is the winner this time around. Fans of the game will be relieved to know that not only is the PC port the only way to play Maiden of Blackwater on the deck, it's also a great way to experience the game. Big props to Personal Computing for allowing this to happen. Well, there you go. After 5 games and 1 funny joke game, that's your lot. You know, it's great to see a more niche franchise like Fatal Frame show up in such a significant way on the deck, with every mainline entry basically playable at the very least. I genuinely scared myself making this episode, as it was my first rodeo with a good amount of these games. With that said, you'll be glad to know that any view you contribute to the video will go toward the procurement of new pants. Join me in the next episode where we'll be siphoning all of the enjoyment we can out of a long dormant Sony franchise. See ya, and thanks for watching.